Hello, today we'll be talking about free will, responsibility, and determinism. To motivate this, I'd like to ask you to imagine a scenario real quick. So, in the scenario, you're pushed off of a building. You fall and land on a passerby, innocent passerby. Uh, the police come immediately, they arrest you. Everyone, the passerby, the courts, they all think that you are blameworthy and you should be put in jail. You, of course, feel this is unjust, right? Like somebody pushed you off of this building. You did not choose to fall on this innocent passerby. Nevertheless, everybody disagrees. Seems a little unjust. Compare this with the case of Timothy McVeigh. Timothy McVeigh, if you don't know, bombed a building in Oklahoma City in 1995. He spent weeks planning the attack, rented a truck, placed homemade bombs inside of it, drove it up to the front of a building, started a timer, and left. The bomb blew up in 2 minutes. 168 people died, 600 people were injured. No one compelled him, not obviously, no one compelled him to do it. He seemed to commit these crimes of his own free will. They were meditated, pre and during. He was, it seems, morally responsible for his actions. Now, we typically believe that sometimes people act freely, and in general, when they do so, they're responsible for what they do. When people act freely, they seem to deserve punishment or reward or praise. We also tend to think that people who don't act freely are not morally responsible, are not blameworthy for the consequence of their actions, or similarly for the praiseworthiness of their actions. These are pretty strongly held intuitions. Let's see if we can be a little more careful about what this amounts to, though, when we talk about act freely and not act freely. So here's a careful articulation of what we'll call the free will principle. This is just that sometimes people act freely. Note this is a weak principle. It's true if just one person acts freely just one time. Still, you might wonder why to think it's true. Well, as I was just saying, intuitively we shouldn't be held responsible for actions we don't choose freely. If I have a seizure and hit someone in the process, I don't plausibly deserve blame for that action. On the other hand, we should be held responsible for actions we do choose freely. If I choose to attend medical school, work hard, and ultimately save lives, plausibly I deserve praise for those actions. Contrast this with what we'll call determinism. Every event is caused by a prior event. Now, what is an event? So events are occurrences. They occur at times and places and involve some manner of change. For instance, class meetings, submitting homework assignments on time, traveling, believing, desiring, etc. And here, by cause, we mean an event X causes some other, just in case X occurs before that other, and X makes the other happen. That's what we mean by causation. Why think determinism is true? It seems to fall out of a lot of observations of cases that you could just pull ready-made from your experience. Consider a case of a flat tire. You are driving down the street, tire blows up for whatever reason. You get out, inspect it, you look around, maybe there's a nail in it. I don't know, maybe you forgot to pump it up full of air. What you don't do when you're trying to figure out what happened is throw your hands up and say, there's no cause, nothing, no reason. Similarly, for the second case I'll think about here or reflect on here, the 2008 stock, a lot of things occurred. It seems like a lot of different separate, maybe independent sometimes events occurred leading up to the market crash in 2008. But I don't think, despite how complex it was, anybody really thought at any time, well, there's just no cause. This, as a matter of fact, leads to case 3 here, right? Like the way we approach science, the way we investigate the world seems to depend on some notion of cause or some notion of determinism, right? We typically assume that every event has a cause and we can find what that event out is. All this amounts to what I was gesturing at the beginning. Free will and determinism are apparently incompatible. What does incompatible mean? Look, P and Q are incompatible just in case they are propositions and it is impossible for them both to be true. So as stated, the free will principle is a proposition and determinism is a proposition. I have them abbreviated here, FWP and DET respectively. In this thesis, I and C will abbreviate it as, this is claiming that these two, it cannot be the case that both FWP and DET are true. As a consequence, if they are incompatible, then if one is true, then the other is false. And if one is false, then the other is true. Here are reasons to think DET is not compatible with FWP. So this is an argument, as stated in previous lecture, has premises and one conclusion. Here's premise one. If every event is caused by a prior event, then every event is completely determined by prior events. So let's assume every event is caused by a prior event. All right, assume, now see what happens. Okay, does it follow that every event is completely determined by prior events? Well, depends on what we mean by completely determined. If what we mean is something like there are previous events that caused a later event, then yeah, it seems pretty plausible. In fact, it almost seems trivial that number one is true. So if every event is caused by a prior event, then every event is completely determined by prior events. That seems plausible. Premise two, if every event is completely determined by prior events, then no person ever acts freely. Why would this be true? Well, assume that every event is completely determined by prior events and see if it follows that no person ever acts freely. Well, if by act freely, what we mean is something like acting without a prior cause or a prior event causing whatever you're doing, then it does follow that no person ever acts freely. Hence from this, you could conclude if every event is caused by a prior event, then no person ever acts freely. But if you note in line 3 here that the part between the if and the then is determinism. That's DET. The part following then in line 3 is the opposite of the free will principle, which is to say, if determinism is true, then the free will principle is false. Let's go the other way. The other direction is if sometimes people act freely, that's the free will principle, then not every event is completely determined by prior events. And if that is true, then not every event is caused by a prior event. Hence, if the free will principle is true, then determinism is false. It does seem plausible that FWP is true. It also seems plausible that DET is true. It also, as we saw from just our reasoning here, it seems like they are incompatible. This can't all be true though, right? Like on pain of inconsistency, we can't hold all three of these to be true. We have to find good reasons to give up at least one of them. Now we're going to be exploring various ways to get out of this puzzle, and we will start off with some extremes and work our way into a few more nuanced theories or nuanced approaches to getting out of this bind. So here is what we might consider our first extreme, hard determinism. So here is the theory, hard determinism. This theory is composed of 3 axioms, and that is it. If anybody ever comes to you and says, what is hard determinism? This is what you would tell them. Every event is caused by a prior event. No person ever acts freely. And a person acts freely just in case. Perform an act that is not caused by a prior event. That is it. Note some observations. Observation 1. If A is true and C is true, then B must be true. Observation 2. Hard determinism is consistent with incompatibilism, though it doesn't say anything about it explicitly. Observation 3. Hard determinism says nothing explicitly about moral responsibility either. Now, why think this is true? Oh, well, let's go back to science, right? Every event, it seems, can be scientifically explained. I mean, this is an assumption that science makes, right? And it seems plausible. It seems defensible. I mean, what events are there that you think science can't explain? Put the burden on somebody to provide that. I mean, science does seem to have a lot within its purview. So it's plausible, especially when we're thinking about things that happen or things that occur over time. Now, if every event can be scientifically explained, then every human action has a prior cause. What does this mean? Well, you might think, well, I wanted to come to class. I wanted to take notes. I wanted to push the button on my computer to make this lecture begin. These things, these are my choice, right? Like I did this. Where's the prior cause? Well, let me tell you. Neurological activity, maybe subconscious desires. Maybe subconscious desires that had neurological activity underwriting them. So all of these neurological phenomena within the scope of science that can be explained by science, and they are events, and they are human actions, or they result in human actions that have prior causes that are within the scope of science. So it's a good reason to think if every event can be scientifically explained, every human action has a prior cause, because human actions are events. Hence, this is a sub-conclusion. Every human action has a prior cause. Now, if every human action has a prior cause, then no person acts freely. Now, if that's true, it follows that no person ever acts freely. And recall, this is the negation of the free will principle. Free will principle is incompatible with determinism. That means determinism, according to this argument, or as a consequence, is true, and the free will principle is false. Now let's consider some arguments against. All right, we have, despite what we said about science, we have substantial first-person evidence that we act freely. In fact, this is where you start in your investigations in the world. Science depends on this. You looking within, you see that you cause things to happen. You are the motivator. You are the thing that makes things happen. You are that cause, right? What is there that's causing you? What else could there be other than you? Substantial first-person evidence that we act freely. It's the world outside of the human experience that's not acting freely that's weird. That's the thing that needs to be explained, right? Not us. We act freely. Stones rolling down hills, that's weird. Or that's the thing. That's a thing that needs to be explained, not us. So we shouldn't be turning the scientific image back on us and saying, oh, all desires and our beliefs must have causes like the way stones are caused to roll down hills. Instead, we start with us and say, we do act freely. Now, what is this oddity going on with stones? Why don't they? Now, that's some justification for premise one. Now, premise two, this is just a principle of evidence, right? We should believe what we have substantial evidence in favor of, right? That seems plausible. If somebody if it looks like somebody has snuck into your apartment, if it looks like they have rustled some things around and gone through your paperwork and found your social security number, if it looks like they have got into your bank account, stole some money, you probably should believe that somebody has broken into your house and stole your identity to some extent, rather than, I don't know, believing a ghost did it or something. There's substantial evidence weighing in favor of that explanation. Typically, we should believe what we have substantial evidence in favor for. Now, if 1 and 2 are true, then it seems like we should believe sometimes people act freely. And if we should, implicit in this is if we should believe that sometimes people act freely because we don't want to go around believing false things, then it looks like sometimes people do act freely. Hence, we can conclude from 1, 2, and 3 that sometimes people do act freely. Now, if that is true, then hard determinism is false. The conclusion of this argument being hard determinism is false. Let's examine another argument. Premise 1, sometimes people do what they choose to do. That seems plausible. Aren't you doing it now? Didn't you choose to do this? You choose to listen to me chatter on and on and on about free will? Of course. Oh. Now, if sometimes people do what they choose to do, then sometimes people act freely. That's just what it means, right? To do what you choose to do. Acting freely. That's the same. Remember Timothy McVeigh bombing a building. Seems like the guy's acting or choosing what he's choosing to do. Seems like he's doing what he's choosing to do. Also seems like he's acting freely. Those seem to go hand in hand. Two lines are true, then sometimes people act freely. And if sometimes people act freely, then you can see this coming. Hard determinism is false. Turning to this next argument. Line 1, sometimes people resist their strong desires. What does that mean? I don't know. You ever wanted to do something like continue to watch Netflix or stop drinking? You ever had a difficult time turning it off or putting the bottle down or whatever, right? Surely you've had some struggles with resisting desires or inclinations, and surely I assume that you overcame some of them. If you did turn Netflix off, didn't you exert your willpower? Isn't that what it means to exert your willpower? You overcame a strong desire. Maybe you wanted something to eat that you shouldn't eat. You decided against it because you're on a diet or something, or you're on a new exercise program. You've overcome this strong desire. It seemed like you were being caused by your desires to do something, and you went another direction. What is that if not choice, right? What is that if not acting freely? And that leads to two. If sometimes people resist their strong desires and sometimes people act freely, what else would it be? You've overcome what presented itself as a somewhat overwhelming cause to do something. You did something else. Good for you. Now, if that's true, then some people do act freely. And if that's true, of course, then hard determinism is false. Let's check this one out. Now, this is a powerful one. Sometimes people are morally responsible for their actions. That seems true. I mean, if you walk over and punch me in the face, and you're like, I'm going to do this on purpose, and then you smack me, I'm going to be like, blame. You're also morally responsible for this action, right? Like, what'd you do? We're going to court, right? Now, sometimes people are morally responsible for some actions. In some cases, then sometimes people do act freely, right? It does seem like if you chose to do that, then you're acting freely. Remember the case of the doctor, right? The physician or somebody who's training to be a doctor goes on, ultimately saves lives. We definitely want to say, I think, that they are praiseworthy for their actions, but I mean, you gotta be responsible for their actions if they're going to be praiseworthy. You don't just go around praising people randomly for stuff they didn't choose to do, right? That'd be weird. That doesn't seem to track with the practice of praise. No, they're responsible for those actions. But also, they chose to do them, right? They acted freely. Otherwise, like, what are we praising them for? Randomness? No, as you can probably tell, this leads to the conclusion being that hard determinism is false. The upshot of this argument is that, look, hard determinism seems to be in conflict with our general practices of blaming and praising. If you think people should be blamed or praised, whether you think people should be blamed or praised as much as they are in our culture, that's a separate question. But you think ultimately, at least one person should be praised or at least one person should be blamed. You got a puzzle here because hard determinism seems to say, nope, excluded. Nope, can't do that. Let me summarize where we've gone. All right, free will, determinism, incompatibility. They're intuitive, but they're all three inconsistent. They can't all be true. We got to figure a way out of the puzzle. Hard determinism is one way out of the puzzle. So that should say HT instead of DET. Hard determinism rejects the free will principle and accepts determinism and is consistent with incompatibilism. That is a way out of the puzzle. Scientific evidence provides reasons to think hard determinism is true. First-person evidence, reflections on responsibility, will, and choice suggest hard determinism is false. Now, I gave you some motivation for thinking the arguments, whether for or against, are sound. In our discussion boards, we will be talking, or while we're engaging in skill training, we will be practicing evaluating these arguments on our own. So you, in particular, will be extracting, or at least presenting these arguments and justification for them or against them by identifying lines in the arguments that you think might be suspicious. And then you will also comment on the evaluations of peers, so that you can get a firmer grip on just how strong or weak these arguments are. And at the end of the discussion board, we should have a firm idea of which of these arguments are good and which of these arguments are maybe just window dressing. So, see you on the discussion board.